They say money can't buy happiness, but let me tell you something. It can sure buy revenge. When my own children threw me away like yesterday's garbage after 40 years of sacrifice, they thought I was just another helpless old woman with nothing left to lose. Boy, were they wrong. By the time I was finished with them, they were begging on their knees for forgiveness, but it was far too late. My name is Vivian, and this is how I went from discarded grandmother to millionaire's wife, leaving my ungrateful family in the dust where they belonged. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what city you're watching from, and don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10 at the end. My name is Vivian Rosewood, and at 74 years old, I've learned that life has a wicked sense of humor. For most of my adult life, I was just Vivian the mother, Vivian the wife, Vivian the woman who worked her fingers to the bone for a family that saw her as nothing more than free labor. I married young to a man named Gerald, who died when our 3 children, Cassandra, Bartholomew, and Serafina, were still teenagers. From that moment on, I became everything to them: mother, father, provider, and servant, all rolled into one exhausted package. I worked double shifts at the furniture factory, came home to cook elaborate meals, helped with homework until midnight, and started the cycle all over again the next morning. When they grew up and moved away, I thought my sacrifice had paid off. Cassandra became a successful real estate agent, Bartholomew opened his own accounting firm, and Serafina married a doctor. They all lived in beautiful houses, drove expensive cars, and took lavish vacations. And I lived in the same tiny apartment I'd rented 30 years ago, surviving on my meager pension and the occasional birthday card with a $20 bill inside. But I didn't mind being forgotten. I told myself that raising successful children was reward enough. I was proud of them even when months passed without a phone call. Even when holidays came and went without invitations. I convinced myself that being busy meant they loved me, even if they never showed it. Little did I know that their indifference was about to become something much worse. The truth about my children's true nature would reveal itself in the most cruel way possible, and it would set in motion a chain of events that would change all our lives forever. You see, I had always been the type of woman who put everyone else's needs before her own. When Gerald died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving me with 3 teenagers and a mountain of debt, I didn't have the luxury of grieving properly. I had to be strong, had to be the rock that held our family together. I worked 16-hour days, sometimes taking on weekend cleaning jobs just to make ends meet. I remember those early years after Gerald's death like a blur of exhaustion and determination. Cassandra needed money for her college applications. Bartholomew wanted to join the debate team, which required expensive trips. And Serafina had her heart set on dance lessons. I said yes to everything, even when it meant I ate crackers for dinner so they could have proper meals. During those years, I developed what I now recognize as a superpower, the ability to stretch a dollar farther than anyone thought possible. I learned to negotiate with landlords, find the best deals on everything from groceries to school supplies, and make our tiny apartment feel like a warm, loving home, despite our financial struggles. I taught myself to be resourceful in ways that would serve me well later in life, though I didn't know it at the time. I learned to read people, to understand what motivated them, and to find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. These skills were born out of necessity, a single mother's desperate need to provide for her children, but they would eventually become the tools of my revenge. The children never seemed to notice how thin I was getting, or how my hands were always rough and red from the cleaning chemicals I used in my weekend jobs. They never asked why I never bought myself new clothes, or why I always claimed I wasn't hungry when there wasn't quite enough food for everyone at dinner. All they saw was that somehow, magically, everything they needed appeared. Their school fees were always paid on time, their clothes were always clean and pressed, and there was always a warm meal waiting for them when they came home from school. They took it for granted that this was just how life worked, never questioning the sacrifice behind their comfort. As they grew older and began to understand money better, I thought they might finally see what I had given up for them. Instead, they seemed almost embarrassed by our modest lifestyle. Cassandra started making excuses for why her friends couldn't come over. Bartholomew complained that other kids had nicer things. Serafina began asking why we couldn't live in a better neighborhood like her dance classmates. Their ingratitude stung, but I told myself that it was normal teenage behavior. Surely when they became adults, they would understand and appreciate what I had done for them. Surely they would want to take care of me the way I had taken care of them. I was very wrong. The years passed in a predictable pattern. They would call on Mother's Day and Christmas, sometimes remembering my birthday if they weren't too busy. Cassandra would send expensive flowers with cards signed by her assistant. Bartholomew would transfer money into my account with automated messages about taking care of myself. Serafina would invite me to family gatherings only when her husband's family couldn't attend, making it clear I was the backup option. I accepted this treatment because I had trained myself to accept so little. I had spent so many years putting their needs first that I had forgotten I was allowed to have needs of my own. I had become invisible in my own life, a supporting character in the stories of the children I had raised to be the stars. But invisibility, I would later learn, can be a powerful weapon. When people don't see you, they don't guard themselves against you. They assume you're harmless, predictable, easily managed. They make the fatal mistake of underestimating what you're capable of when you finally decide to fight back. The transformation from devoted mother to strategic adversary didn't happen overnight. It began with small moments of clarity, realizing that my children saw me as an obligation rather than a person, understanding that their success had been built on my sacrifice without any gratitude or recognition. But the real awakening was still coming, and when it arrived, it would shatter every illusion I had about the family I thought I had raised.
The first sign that something was wrong came on a rainy Tuesday in October. I'd been feeling dizzy and weak for weeks, but I'd ignored it like I'd ignored every other ache and pain that came with age. After all, who had time to be sick when there were bills to pay and a life to maintain? But when I collapsed in the grocery store and woke up in the hospital with concerned strangers hovering over me, I knew I couldn't ignore my body's warnings any longer. Dr. Williams was a kind man with gentle eyes that couldn't quite hide the concern behind his professional demeanor. "Mrs. Rosewood, I'm afraid we need to discuss your test results," he said, pulling up a chair beside my hospital bed. "You have severe anemia, and your kidney function is declining rapidly. You're going to need regular dialysis treatments, 3 times a week, 4 hours each session, and you'll need help at home. This isn't something you can manage alone." The words hit me like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. Dialysis. Help at home. Can't manage alone. These weren't phrases I had ever imagined applying to my life. I had always been the one who managed, who took care of things, who found a way to make everything work. Now I was being told I would need to depend on others. But I nodded confidently, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "Of course, doctor. I have 3 children who will surely help me through this." The words came out automatically, born from decades of believing in the family bonds I thought I had forged through sacrifice and unconditional love. I called Cassandra first. "Mother, what's wrong? I'm in the middle of a very important showing," she said, clearly annoyed. When I explained my diagnosis and need for help, her response chilled me to the bone. "Mother, this is very inconvenient timing. Surely there's a care facility that can handle this." Bartholomew arrived hours later, checking his phone constantly. "Mom, this is terrible timing. Miranda just had the baby and I'm swamped with work. You've always been so independent. I'm sure you'll figure something out." And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the steady beep of the heart monitor and the growing realization that the children I had sacrificed everything for saw my crisis as nothing more than an inconvenience. Serafina was the last to arrive, and she was by far the cruelest. She swept into the room like a hurricane of perfume and irritation, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her manicured hands. She didn't even sit down. "Mother, what is this about? I had to cancel my spa appointment to come here, and frankly, you look fine to me." Fine. I looked fine. I was attached to an IV, weak from blood loss, facing a future of medical dependency, and I looked fine to her. When I explained my diagnosis and the doctor's recommendations, Serafina actually rolled her eyes. "Mother, you're being dramatic. Plenty of people your age manage these things independently. You'll figure it out." Dramatic. The woman who had raised her, worked 3 jobs to pay for her dance lessons, and never complained about a single sacrifice, was being called dramatic for being seriously ill? That's when Dr. Williams returned with the final blow. He looked uncomfortable as he glanced between my children and me, clearly sensing the tension in the room, but determined to make sure they understood the gravity of my situation. He wanted to make sure everyone understands, he said carefully. "Mrs. Rosewood will need assistance with daily activities. She can't live alone anymore. The treatments will leave her weak, and without proper support, her condition will deteriorate rapidly. We're talking about basic things like transportation to appointments, help with groceries, someone to check on her regularly. The silence in that hospital room was deafening. My 3 children, the people I sacrificed everything for, the ones I'd gone without food to feed, the ones I worked myself to exhaustion to provide for, looked at each other like I was a burden they were trying to figure out how to dispose of. They didn't look at me with love or concern or even basic human compassion. They looked at me like I was a problem that had suddenly appeared in their well-ordered lives, demanding inconvenient solutions they weren't willing to provide. "Well," Cassandra finally said, her voice as cold as winter wind, "I suppose we'll have to look into state-funded senior care. There are facilities for people in mother's situation." My situation. As if being sick and old was some kind of moral failing, some character flaw that made me unworthy of their time and attention. Bartholomew nodded quickly, clearly relieved that someone else had suggested the solution he was too cowardly to voice himself. "That makes sense. Mom, you always said you wanted to be independent. This way you'll have professional care and won't have to worry about being a burden on anyone." A burden. The word hung in the air between us like a slap. The woman who had been everything to them when they needed her was now nothing more than a burden to be managed and disposed of. Serafina was already reaching for her phone. "I'll have my assistant research facilities. There must be waiting lists, but I'm sure we can expedite things." She spoke like she was arranging catering for a party, not deciding the fate of the woman who had given her life meaning and purpose. That night, alone in my hospital bed, I stared at the ceiling and felt something die inside me. It wasn't hope. I had been slowly losing that for years. It wasn't love. That had been bleeding out of me with every ignored phone call and forgotten birthday. It was the last vestige of the woman that I had been, the devoted mother who believed that sacrifice would be rewarded with loyalty. In its place, something new was born. Something cold and calculating and absolutely determined to show my children exactly what they had thrown away. They wanted to see me as powerless. They wanted to treat me like I was already dead. Perfect. Dead women have nothing left to lose, which makes them very, very dangerous. That's when I decided they had messed with the wrong grandmother.
The discharge day arrived with all the warmth of a business transaction. Cassandra had arranged for me to be transferred directly to Sunset Manor, a state-run facility that looked like something out of a nightmare. The building was gray concrete with tiny windows that seemed designed to keep hope from entering, and the smell of industrial disinfectant couldn't mask the underlying odor of despair and forgotten dreams. "It's really quite nice, Mother," Cassandra lied smoothly as she signed the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who had researched the cheapest possible option. "And it's completely covered by Medicare. You won't be a financial burden on anyone." A financial burden? Those words echoed in my head as I was wheeled into a room barely larger than a prison cell, complete with a roommate named Ethel who spent her days talking to imaginary cats, and a view of the parking lot where other families visited their own forgotten relatives, families that still cared enough to visit. My children left quickly that day, each making vague promises about visiting soon while checking their phones for more important obligations. Cassandra kissed my cheek with the same warmth she might show a business associate. Bartholomew shook my hand like we'd just concluded a successful meeting. Serafina waved from the doorway, already mentally moving on to her next appointment. And then I was alone with the institutional beige walls, the scratchy polyester bedding, and the devastating realization that the people I had devoted my entire life to had just discarded me like an old piece of furniture they no longer wanted cluttering up their perfect homes. For 2 weeks, I wallowed in self-pity and righteous anger. I attended the mandatory activities with the enthusiasm of a prisoner in solitary confinement. I picked at the flavorless meals while listening to other residents tell stories about grandchildren who visited and children who called regularly. I pretended to watch television in the common room while inside I was screaming with rage and humiliation. But during those long, sleepless nights, listening to Ethel's conversations with her imaginary companions and the institutional sounds of loneliness, something began to crystallize in my mind. I wasn't just angry, I was calculating. The sharp mind that had managed a household budget for decades, that had negotiated with creditors and found creative solutions to impossible problems, began to work on the biggest challenge of my life. You see, my children had made one crucial mistake. They assumed I was powerless because I was old and sick. They had no idea that 40 years of stretching every dollar, managing crisis after crisis, and surviving on pure determination had made me incredibly resourceful. More importantly, they had no idea what I had been quietly doing with my savings for the past 20 years. While they were building their successful careers and expensive lifestyles, assuming I was just scraping by on my pension, I had been investing. Not in flashy stocks or risky ventures, but in small, steady investments that grew quietly over time. I had been buying shares in utility companies, municipal bonds, dividend-paying stocks, boring investments that produced reliable returns. By the time I entered Sunset Manor, my portfolio was worth just over $200,000. Not a fortune by their standards, but more than enough to change my circumstances completely if I played my cards right. And I was about to discover that I wasn't the only resident of Sunset Manor with hidden resources and untapped potential. That's when I noticed Harold Blackwood. At 81, Harold was easily the most distinguished resident of the facility, which wasn't saying much until you looked closer. While other residents shuffled around in hospital gowns and slippers, Harold wore pressed slacks and button-down shirts. While they watched daytime television, he read financial newspapers on his tablet. While they complained about the food, he quietly supplemented his meals from deliveries from upscale restaurants. Harold hadn't always lived at Sunset Manor, and he certainly didn't live there out of financial necessity. He moved in after his wife Eleanor died 3 years earlier, not because he couldn't afford better care, but because he was desperately lonely and the manor's social activities provided structure to his empty days. What my children didn't know, what none of the staff at Sunset Manor fully understood, was that Harold Blackwood owned half the commercial real estate in the city. The building where Cassandra's real estate office was located, Harold owned it. The shopping center where Bartholomew's accounting firm operated, part of Harold's portfolio. The medical practice where Seraphina's husband worked, they rented space in one of Harold's properties. My children had no idea they were already connected to the man who would become my weapon of choice, my path to the kind of power that could reshape all of our lives. Harold was a romantic, a widower who missed his late wife with the kind of devotion that made other people uncomfortable. Every evening, he sat in the manor's pathetic excuse for a garden, talking to Eleanor's photograph and feeding stray cats with gourmet treats he ordered online. The other residents thought he was eccentric. I thought he was perfect. My plan began to form, like a beautiful, terrible flower blooming in my mind. I would win Harold's heart, not just for companionship, though I suspect that might come naturally, but for access to the power and influence he commanded. And once I had that access, I would systematically dismantle every comfortable assumption my children had about their perfect lives. They wanted to forget about their mother. They wanted to treat me like I was already dead and buried. Perfect. I would rise from this institutional grave they put me in, and when I emerged, I would be more powerful than they had ever imagined possible. The woman they had abandoned would become the woman who controlled their destinies. The mother they dismissed as powerless would become the force that could make or break their carefully constructed success. They thought they were done with me, but I was just getting started. And Harold Blackwood, lonely widower and secret real estate mogul, was going to help me teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives. Little did they know that their biggest mistake wasn't just abandoning their mother. It was underestimating what a woman with nothing left to lose could accomplish when she set her mind to revenge.
Phase 1 of my plan began with careful observation and strategic patience. I studied Harold Blackwood like a general studying battlefield terrain, learning his habits, his preferences, his vulnerabilities. He woke every morning at exactly 6 a.m. and walked the manor's grounds while reading financial newspapers on his tablet, always taking the same route past the rose bushes that had seen better days. He preferred Earl Grey tea to coffee, classical music to the popular songs they played in the common room, and had a weakness for homemade cookies, something he mentioned wistfully when talking about Eleanor's baking. More importantly, I learned about his loneliness. Harold was a man who had been deeply in love for 57 years, and Eleanor's death had left him adrift in a world that suddenly felt empty and purposeless. He talked to her photograph every evening, sharing the day's events and asking for her guidance on decisions both large and small. The other residents thought this was charming but eccentric. I recognized it as the behavior of a man desperate for connection, for someone who could understand the depth of his loss and help fill the void she had left behind. I started small, a plate of oatmeal raisin cookies left at his door, classical music playing during his reading time, conversations about financial news that revealed my business understanding. "You're not like the other residents here," he told me one evening. "You have a sharp mind." Over weeks, I shared carefully edited life stories, painting myself as a woman who chose independence over family burdens. Harold was enchanted by my combination of strength and vulnerability. The breakthrough came when Harold mentioned investment problems. I offered to review his portfolio and was astounded. He was worth $50 million, but being poorly managed by his advisor. I spent days analyzing his finances, then presented solutions that could improve his returns by 30%. "This is extraordinary work," he said, looking at me with new respect and romantic interest. "Where did you learn this?" "Necessity is the best teacher," I replied simply. "When you have limited resources, you learn to make every dollar count. When you're responsible for other people's welfare, you learn to see through the promises to the reality underneath." That night, Harold asked me to accompany him to dinner in the city, our first official date. As I dressed in the best outfit I could manage from my limited wardrobe, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the thrill of having power, of being valued for my intelligence and skills, rather than just my willingness to serve others. The restaurant was elegant, the kind of place my children frequented, but where I had never set foot. Harold treated me like a queen, introducing me to the staff as my dear friend Vivian, one of the sharpest minds I've ever encountered. Over wine and perfectly prepared food, we talked about business, about investments, about the satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful with your own hands and intelligence. "I haven't felt this engaged, this alive since Eleanor died," Harold told me as he walked me back to the manor that evening. "You've reminded me that there's still joy to be found in good conversation and genuine companionship." The transformation in our relationship was swift but natural. Within weeks, Harold was spending every evening with me, sharing stories about his business empire and his deep love for Eleanor. He told me about the properties he owned throughout the city, the investments that had made him wealthy, and the loneliness that had consumed him since Eleanor's death. More importantly, he began asking for my advice on business decisions. When a tenant wanted to renegotiate a lease, he consulted me. When his property manager suggested renovations, he asked for my opinion. When his financial advisor pushed aggressive investments, he wanted my analysis first. I was becoming indispensable to him, not just as romantic companionship, but as a trusted business partner. The lonely widower was finding purpose again through our collaboration, and I was discovering that my decades of careful money management had prepared me for exactly this opportunity. "Vivian, I have a proposition," Harold said one evening as we walked through the manor's garden. "I know this is unconventional, but would you consider moving in with me? Not here at the manor, but in my penthouse. I have more space that I know what to do with, and frankly, I value your counsel too much to limit our conversations to visiting hours." Moving in together was a crucial step toward marriage, and marriage would give me legal access to Harold's empire. But I played it carefully, expressing concern about appearances and propriety. "Harold, I care about you deeply, but I wouldn't want people to think I was taking advantage of your loneliness." "Taking advantage?" He laughed genuinely for the first time since I'd known him. "Vivian, you've already saved me more money than most people earn in a lifetime. If anyone's taking advantage, it's me benefiting from your brilliant mind." The penthouse was everything I had never dared to dream of. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, marble countertops,
a library that could hold thousands of books, and a master suite larger than my entire former apartment. But more than the luxury, I loved the feeling of being valued, of being seen as an equal partner rather than a burden. Within a month of moving in, Harold proposed, not with the desperate neediness of a lonely old man, but with the confident assurance of someone who had found exactly what he was looking for. "Vivian, you have brought light back into my life. You've made me remember who I was before grief consumed me. Will you marry me?" As I lay in my narrow institutional bed that night, listening to Eartha mumble to her imaginary cats, I smiled for the first time since entering Sunset Manor. Phase 1 of my plan was nearly complete. Harold Blackwood was falling in love with me, and I was falling in love with the power that came with being seen as valuable, intelligent, and worthy of respect.
6 months after my children had dumped me at Sunset Manor like unwanted furniture, I stood in the penthouse apartment of the Blackwood Tower, wearing a designer dress that cost more than my former yearly rent, and signed my name on a marriage certificate. Vivian Blackwood had such a lovely ring to it, don't you think? The wedding was small but elegant, exactly what Harold and I both wanted. No family drama, no pretense, just two people who had found genuine companionship and mutual respect in the later stages of life. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was experiencing the happiest day of my adult life precisely because my ungrateful children had given me the freedom to create a completely new existence. Harold wasn't just wealthy. He was strategically connected to every aspect of my children's professional lives in ways they had never bothered to investigate. And now, as his wife, I had access to all of it. The revenge I had been planning was about to unfold like a perfectly choreographed dance of destruction. "Mrs. Blackwood," Harold's property manager said respectfully as he handed me the quarterly reports, "your husband has asked me to give you full access to all property information. He says you have excellent instincts for these matters." Full access. The words were sweeter than any endearment. As I reviewed the extensive portfolio of Harold's real estate holdings, I felt like a general studying maps before a decisive battle. There was Cassandra's office building, Bartholomew's shopping center, the medical complex where Serafina's husband worked. My children had been paying rent to the man who was now my husband, never knowing they were already connected to the mother they had so callously abandoned. But I didn't rush into my revenge. Good strategists understand that timing is everything, and patience is often the most powerful weapon. Instead, I spent my first month as Harold's wife learning every detail of his business empire, understanding the intricate web of connections that could be leveraged when the moment was right. Harold was delighted by my interest and involvement. "You have a natural gift for this," he told me, as we reviewed potential acquisitions over breakfast in our marble-appointed dining room. Eleanor was brilliant, but her talents lay in other areas. "You understand the mechanics of wealth in a way that astounds me." I had traded my tiny apartment and institutional meals for penthouse luxury and 5-star dining. But more importantly, I had traded powerlessness for influence that extended throughout the city. When I spoke, people listened. When I made suggestions, they were implemented. When I expressed interest in particular properties or investments, Harold made them happen. The first test of my new power came when Harold mentioned a difficult tenant problem. "Sometimes difficult tenants just need the right motivation," I suggested. Within a week, the tenant moved out after receiving perfectly legal notices about inspections and compliance issues. Harold was impressed. "You have a gift for handling delicate situations," he said admiringly. That's when I knew I was ready for phase 2. My children's lease renewals were approaching, perfect timing for a systematic demonstration of what they had thrown away. But first I needed to establish my credibility in Harold's business circle and ensure that when I made my moves against my children, it would look like sound business decisions rather than personal vendetta. I began attending Harold's business meetings, contributing insights that consistently proved valuable and profitable. "Mrs. Blackwood has an exceptional understanding of market dynamics," Harold would tell his associates proudly. "She sees opportunities and risks that others miss entirely." The business community began to take notice of Harold's sharp, elegant wife who could analyze complex financial situations and suggest improvements that consistently generated impressive returns. I was building a reputation as someone whose business judgment could be trusted implicitly. 3 months into our marriage, Harold made an announcement that sealed my position of power.
He wanted to formalize Vivian's role in our business operations, he told his lawyers and accountants. She'll be taking over day-to-day management of the property portfolio with full authority to make decisions regarding leases, renovations, and tenant relations. Full authority over the properties where my children worked. The irony was so delicious I could barely contain my satisfaction. The woman they had dismissed as powerless and worthless now controlled the commercial spaces that were essential to their professional success. Harold's decision wasn't based on favoritism or romantic sentiment. It was based on the undeniable results I had produced. Under my management, vacancy rates dropped, rental income increased, and problem tenants found more suitable arrangements elsewhere. I was proving myself to be exactly what Harold had suspected, a brilliant business mind that had been underutilized for decades. Darling, I've been reviewing the upcoming lease renewals, and I think we need to be more aggressive about bringing our properties up to current market rates. Which properties specifically? He asked, trusting my judgment completely. I smiled, thinking of my 3 ungrateful children going about their daily lives, completely unaware that their fate now rested in the hands of the mother they had thrown away. Oh, just a few commercial spaces that have been underperforming. Nothing you need to worry about. I'll handle the details personally. Harold kissed my forehead affectionately. I don't know what I did to deserve such a capable partner. You've made me feel useful again, like my life has purpose beyond just existing. As I looked out over the city that night, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I had experienced during my 40 years of selfless devotion to ungrateful children. I had power now, real power, the kind that could reshape lives and alter destinies. And I was about to use every bit of it to teach my children the most expensive lesson they would ever receive. They had thrown away their mother when she needed the most, assuming she was powerless and worthless. Soon, they would discover that the woman they had discarded was now the woman who held their professional futures in her hands. The mother they had abandoned had become the force that could make or break their carefully constructed success. But what happened next would show them that their biggest mistake was not just neglecting their family obligations. It was underestimating the strategic brilliance of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain.
The first domino fell on a cold February morning when Cassandra received the lease renewal notice for her real estate office. I had crafted the document personally, ensuring every clause was perfectly legal while being absolutely devastating to her business model. Market rate adjustments, the notice explained in professional language, reflect current commercial property values in prime downtown locations. What it didn't mention was that I had researched comparable properties extensively and set Cassandra's new rent at the absolute maximum the market would bear, triple her current rate. Cassandra called the property management company immediately, demanding to speak with whoever had made such an obvious error. The property manager, following my specific instructions, politely explained that all rental decisions were now made by Mrs. Vivian Blackwood, the owner's wife, who had extensive experience in commercial real estate analysis. Mrs. Blackwood has reviewed every lease in our portfolio, the manager explained smoothly, and determined that several properties have been significantly under market for years. We're simply bringing them in line with current valuations. I waited 3 days before returning Cassandra's increasingly frantic phone calls, timing my response for maximum psychological impact. When I finally called her back, I used my most professional tone, the voice of a successful businesswoman rather than the discarded mother she remembered. Miss Sterling, this is Vivian Blackwood from Blackwood Properties. I understand you have questions about your lease renewal? The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. I could practically hear Cassandra's mind racing as she tried to process what she was hearing. Finally, she found her voice. Mother? Is that? How did you? What is this? I prefer Mrs. Blackwood in professional contexts. Now, regarding your lease renewal, the terms are quite standard for prime commercial space in the downtown corridor. Did you have specific questions about the market analysis? Market analysis? Cassandra's voice cracked slightly. Mother, you can't possibly be serious about this rent increase. It will destroy my business. Mrs. Blackwood, I corrected again, and I'm afraid business considerations are exactly what drive these decisions. Commercial real estate is an investment, not a charity. I'm sure someone with your professional expertise understands that. The beautiful irony was that Cassandra couldn't argue with the business logic. The rent increase was entirely justified by market conditions. She also couldn't claim family favoritism without admitting that she had abandoned her mother when she needed help most. She was trapped by her own cold professionalism and her complete dismissal of family bonds. "But surely we can work something out," she said desperately. "Some kind of family consideration?" Family consideration? I let a note of ice enter my voice. "I wasn't aware we had that kind of relationship, Miss Sterling. My understanding was that family members help each other during difficult times, visit regularly, and maintain close personal connections. Does that describe our relationship?" Another long silence. Cassandra knew she was beaten, but she tried one last desperate gambit. "What do you want from me?" "I want market rate for prime commercial real estate. Nothing more, nothing less." "It's just business, dear. Surely you understand." Cassandra had 30 days to either pay the new rent or vacate the premises. I knew she couldn't afford the increase. I had researched her business finances as thoroughly as I had analyzed Harold's portfolio. She would be forced to relocate to a much smaller, less prestigious location, and the disruption would cost her at least half of her client base. Bartholomew's turn came in April with similarly devastating precision. His accounting firm occupied space in a shopping center that was scheduled for major renovations that I had specifically commissioned after reviewing the property's potential for improvement. "The renovation will require all tenants to relocate temporarily," I explained to him during our carefully orchestrated phone call. "However, given the extensive nature of the improvements, we've decided to not offer relocation guarantees. Tenants will need to reapply for space in the renovated center at the new market rates." The new market rates, of course, would be completely unaffordable for a small accounting firm, even one as successful as Bartholomew thought his was. The renovated space would attract much larger corporate tenants who could pay premium rates for premium amenities. "But we've been good tenants for 5 years, protested Bartholomew. "Doesn't that count for anything?" "Of course it does," I replied warmly. "Good tenants always receive excellent references when applying for new space elsewhere. I'll be happy to provide a reference letter confirming that your rent was always paid on time." The most satisfying moment was watching Bartholomew realize that his business success had been built on below-market rents that were about to disappear forever. His overhead would double overnight, his client base would be disrupted by relocation, and his profit margins would evaporate. Serafina's husband faced the most elegant trap of all. The medical practice where he worked was part of a larger healthcare complex that was being converted to a specialized cardiac center. I had researched the market extensively and determined that cardiac specialty care was both more profitable and less dependent on individual physicians. "We're transitioning to a model that better serves the community's healthcare needs," I explained to the practice manager who called to inquire about lease renewal options. "General practice medicine is becoming less viable in prime medical real estate, while specialized cardiac care commands premium rates and serves a larger patient population. The practice would have to relocate to a less desirable medical facility, one that catered to general practitioners rather than specialists. Serafina's husband would see his income drop significantly, his prestige diminish, and his patient base scattered across the city as they sought care closer to their homes. But the real masterpiece came when I arranged for all 3 lease terminations to take effect within the same month. My children would all face their professional crises simultaneously, creating a situation where they couldn't help each other and would be forced to acknowledge that their problems had a common source. The woman they had discarded as powerless had orchestrated their downfall with surgical precision, using nothing but legal business practices and market rate pricing. They couldn't claim discrimination, couldn't file complaints, can't even argue that they were being treated unfairly by any objective standard. They had simply learned what it felt like to be considered disposable by someone who held power over their lives, exactly what they had done to me when I needed them most. But what happened next made them realize their biggest mistake was thinking they could simply walk away from family without consequences. I waited until Thanksgiving to make my grand revelation, timing it for maximum psychological impact, when my children would be most vulnerable and desperate for solutions to their rapidly deteriorating professional situations. Harold and I hosted an elegant dinner party at our penthouse, complete with a professional photographer to document our happiness for the society pages. The guest list was carefully curated to include everyone important in the city's business community: the mayor, prominent lawyers, successful entrepreneurs, and most importantly, several people my children desperately needed to impress in their current crises. The invitations went out on cream-colored stationery with gold embossing. Mr. and Mrs. Harold Blackwood request the pleasure of your company for Thanksgiving dinner. The return address was our penthouse, and the guest list read like a who's who of the city's power structure. As fate would have it, all three of my children had to attend this party for professional reasons, each unaware that the others would be there. Cassandra was trying to sell a property to one of Harold's business partners, one of the few clients she had lost during her forced relocation to inferior office space. Bartholomew was hoping to pitch his accounting services to the mayor, whose campaign finances needed professional management. Serafina's husband needed to network with the medical professionals who would be attending, desperately seeking referrals to rebuild his diminished practice. They arrived separately, each dressed in their finest clothes, wearing forced smiles while their professional lives crumbled. The irony was exquisite. They were attending a party hosted by the woman they had abandoned, seeking help from people who now saw that woman as Harold's brilliant wife. None of them noticed the elegant lady in silver greeting guests alongside Harold. They were too focused on their networking goals, too desperate to save their failing businesses. Until I turned around. The look of recognition on Cassandra's face was absolutely priceless. Her champagne glass actually slipped from her fingers as she realized that the distinguished lady of the manor, the woman she had been hoping to impress as a potential client, was the mother she had abandoned in a nursing home just 18 months earlier. Bartholomew's face went completely white when Harold introduced me as my beloved wife Vivian to the exact group of business leaders he had been hoping to win back as clients. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he processed the reality that the woman controlling his professional fate was the same woman he had dismissed as a burden. Serafina's reaction was the most satisfying of all. She actually gasped out loud when she realized that the sophisticated hostess graciously welcoming the city's medical elite was the same woman she had called dramatic for being seriously ill. Her face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, horror, and finally dawning terror as she understood the implications. "Children," I said warmly, as if we had just run into each other at the grocery store, "how lovely to see you again. Harold, darling, let me introduce you to my family. This is Cassandra, Bartholomew, and Serafina. We haven't spoken in months." Harold, bless his heart, was the perfect gentleman. He had no idea of our history, knowing only that I had chosen independence over family obligations years ago. "How wonderful to meet Vivian's children. She's told me so much about how independent and self-sufficient you all are. She's so proud of how well you manage without any family support." The irony was delicious and devastating. My children stood there, trapped by social convention, unable to cause a scene at such an important event, while I held court as the queen of their professional world. Every person they needed to impress was watching Harold treat me like a cherished partner, listening to him praise my business acumen, seeing me as the sophisticated woman who had captured the heart and mind of the city's most successful investor. Cassandra handles commercial real estate, though she's navigating some challenging transitions. Bartholomew runs an accounting firm, also adapting to changing circumstances. And Serafina's husband is rebuilding his medical practice after recent adjustments. The room nodded sympathetically at these struggling children despite having such an accomplished mother. The subtext was clear. Here was a brilliant woman whose family didn't deserve her support. As dinner progressed, I watched my children squirm through course after course, unable to network effectively because everyone was more interested in talking to Harold and me about business opportunities and investment strategies.
They had come to this party hoping to rebuild their professional lives, only to discover that their biggest obstacle was also their hostess. During dessert, Harold stood to make a toast. "I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and I want to publicly acknowledge the woman who has transformed not just my life, but my entire approach to business. Vivian's strategic insight and analytical brilliance have improved every aspect of our operations. She has a gift for seeing potential where others see problems, and for making decisions that benefit everyone involved." The applause was genuine and enthusiastic. Here was a room of successful people acknowledging that I was not just Harold's wife, but his equal partner in building and maintaining wealth. Then, Harold made the announcement that sealed my victory completely. "I'm also pleased to announce that Vivian will be taking an even more active role in our business operations going forward. She'll be personally overseeing all major investment decisions and property management strategies. Anyone who wants to do business with Blackwood Properties will have the pleasure of working with the sharpest business mind I've ever encountered." The room erupted in congratulations and requests for meetings. Business cards appeared like magic as the city's power brokers lined up to ingratiate themselves with the woman who now controlled one of the largest investment portfolios in the region. And my 3 children stood there, watching their abandoned mother receive the respect, admiration, and professional recognition they had never bothered to offer, while their own careers crumbled under the weight of decisions she had made with cool, strategic precision. But what happened next would make them realize that this public humiliation was only the beginning of the lesson they needed to learn.
That Thanksgiving dinner changed everything. But the real transformation in my relationship with my children happened over the weeks and months that followed. Within 7 days of the party, all 3 of them called, suddenly very concerned about my health and happiness. Suddenly they wanted to have regular dinners and family gatherings. Suddenly I was invited to birthdays and holidays and soccer games. But it was far too late for their fake affection. Cassandra was first to reach out. "Mother, I realize we haven't been close. Would you like lunch this week?" "I prefer Mrs. Blackwood in professional settings," I replied sweetly, "though I appreciate your call." The conversation grew increasingly awkward as she realized forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. Bartholomew showed up unannounced at our penthouse. "Mom, my lease situation is challenging. Any chance of family rates?" "When I needed family support in the hospital, you told me to be self-sufficient," I reminded him calmly. I found that advice very helpful. He left empty-handed, finally understanding the consequences of his choices. Serafina brought her children, hoping grandchildren would soften me. I was gracious to the innocent kids, showing them Harold's antique toys, but maintained cool politeness with her. When she mentioned wanting me more involved in their lives, I simply asked, "Before when? I don't recall being invited to participate." Over the following months, my children tried everything to rebuild our relationship. They sent expensive gifts, which I donated to charity. They invited me to events, which I attended if my schedule permitted, always bringing Harold and treating them as social obligations rather than family gatherings. Most importantly, they understood their mother was now a woman with options. I didn't need their love, attention, or approval. I had found happiness without them. The final lesson came when Harold updated his will, establishing a trust fund for worthy family members who demonstrate genuine care and respect. My children knew their mother would decide who deserved Harold's legacy. Some might say my revenge was cruel. I call it educational. I taught them that actions have consequences, that loyalty matters, and that you should never underestimate a grandmother with nothing to lose and everything to gain. The best part? Harold's genuine love wasn't part of my revenge. It was an unexpected bonus. In teaching my children about respect and family bonds, I accidentally found the kind of partnership and companionship I'd never experienced in 40 years of selfless devotion to ungrateful people. Harold and I have been married for 2 years now, and I've never been happier. My children still try to rebuild our relationship, but they do it from a position of respect now. They've learned that underestimating someone because of their age is a mistake they can't afford to make twice. So remember, respect your elders because that forgotten old woman might become the most powerful person in your world. Family isn't about blood, it's about showing up when it matters. And if you don't show up for family, don't be surprised when they show you exactly what you've lost. Now, what city are you watching from? And rate this story 0 to 10. If you enjoyed Justice Served with Strategic Brilliance, subscribe for more grandmother stories. Because sometimes the best revenge is becoming so successful that your enemies smile while their world crumbles. Trust me, it's absolutely delicious.